Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us for this webinar. I see we have 69 participants already logged in, and I'm sure that number is counting. We look forward to your participation this afternoon. My name is Ellen Chigwanda, and I'm with KUSA, and I'll be chairing this session. Next slide, please. So just a few housekeeping issues. We kindly request that you keep your microphone on mute and that you turn off your video to minimize background noise. Also, if you could kindly post your questions in the chat area at any time, we'll respond to as many as possible. Where possible, could you kindly direct your questions to a specific presenter, as this will help us to organize the questions during the Q&A at the end. The session is being recorded, and both the recording and the presentations will be shared on the INEE website. Next slide, please. Next slide, please, Peter.
It's not responding. There.
Thanks. So just a bit of an overview. Since 2010, the INEE Gender Pocket Guide has been the leading authority on how to ensure the needs of girls and boys are addressed in the design and delivery of education in the context of conflict and crisis. Now, almost 10 years later, the INEE Guidance Note on Gender builds on the Gender Pocket Guide to respond to the new landscape, sharing current lessons learned and experience from a range of partners. The following presentations aim to provide an overview and some highlights of each of the 5 key sections of the guide, complemented by 3 case studies. We will not be delving into the detail of each topic, but rather seeking to introduce users to the content and use of the guide, as well as soliciting feedback from all of you on future uptake activities. I'll now hand over to Peter Hill-Larson, who's the coordinator for advocacy with INEE, to introduce the new guidance note on gender before we proceed the overview of each section and the case studies. Peter?
Yes, thank you. I have my slides are somehow not responding. I'm terribly sorry about this. Something wrong with my slideshow. There it is. Sorry, there seems to be something wrong. So anyway, thank you, Ellen. Just a little background and introduction. Girls and boys, they face multiple threats to accessing safe and quality education in crisis-affected context, due, of course, to a lot of different forms of discrimination. So without strategies to address these different and often unique barriers to accessing education in crisis settings, we will simply fail to reach those who are furthest behind, and the SDG targets will not be met. Because according to a study by Plan International this year, if we are on current trajectory, we will by 2030, we will have 1 in 5 girls in crisis-affected countries who will still not be able to read a simple sentence. So in order to address this, or these challenges, there's a need for practical guidance on advancing gender equality in the context of conflict and crisis. This has never been greater, and the INEE guidance on gender has therefore been updated, as Ellen said, to reflect this shift in context, in approaches and modalities. Gender Pocket Guide was published 10 years ago. So it responds in a way, at least in 3 ways. Crises are becoming more protracted in nature. While originally designed as a short-term stopgap, humanitarian assistance has expanded into recovery and into basic service provision. And gender, of course, straddles these different 2 situations. It must be considered both in the education emergency programming at the outset of a crisis to ensure the principles of gender equality and active participation of girls and boys in education continues into recovery and long-term development. Secondly, there's been a significant shift in the aid landscape, including advances in commitments to providing inclusive and equitable quality education, as well as achieving gender equality and empowerment. women and girls. We've seen this through the SDGs, through the Education 2030 framework, and last year, of course, also with the Charleroi Declaration in Canada. Lastly, new guidance also reflects new collaborative mechanisms and tools and standards. For example, changes in the way we work, including the introduction of the cluster system around 10 years ago. So the updated guidance also reflects these more recent resources, such as the revised Interagency Standing Committee's Gender Handbook and the GPV guidelines, as well as information on new gender and age markers. So in a way, the new guidance note incorporates the latest strategies, approaches, and good practices, including evidence-based case studies from 14 countries worldwide, and we'll get to these case studies in a minute. I just want to highlight, of course, that the guidance note now is available in English, French, Spanish, and Portuguese, and soon it will be in Arabic as well. 5 official languages. Just before we go into the case studies, just want us to reflect a little, of course, on what a gender-responsive education and emergency programming looks like. It must be designed to equip education and emergency actors to address challenges with concrete and practical ideas how to promote gender equality in and through education and emergency programming. So a gender-responsive EIE programming identifies and addresses the different needs of both girls and boys and women and men to promote equal outcomes. So that's the end goal, the equal outcomes. An example here may be that you can build separate toilet blocks for girls and boys, and that is gender sensitive, but also considering safe and private hand washing facilities and access to sanitary ware for girls has perhaps gone that step further to be gender responsive. On that example, I will hand it back to Ellen.
Thanks, Peter. So moving over to the overview of the 5 key sections of the guidance note. The first section of the guide provides an overview of strategies for gender-responsive participation, coordination, and analysis. We shall briefly cover all the 3 areas in this section of the webinar with 2 case studies from Kenya and Somalia. Next slide, please. Starting with gender-responsive strategies for participation. This involves ensuring the inclusion of all those affected by crisis in the design, implementation, and M&E of the programs, and ensuring that the needs and rights of all groups are adequately addressed through understanding the factors that facilitate or hinder girls and boys from attending and participating in education. Participation can also work by actively engaging community members in program design and delivery, as we shall now see with the example of WUSC's program in Kenya, which seeks to expand support for girls' education among refugees and IDPs. I'm pleased to introduce Stephanie McBride to take us through this case study. Stephanie?
Thanks so much, Ellen. Hi everyone, my name is Stephanie McBride. I'm an education advisor with World University Service of Canada. We are a mid-sized Canadian NGO. We work in the areas of education, economic opportunities, and empowerment, and focus on women, youth, and refugees as some of our key constituencies. So Peter, next slide, please. I'm here today to talk about our experience with community mobilization in education and emergencies, specifically with our Kenya Equity and Education Project, KEEP. So this project is currently in its 2nd phase. It is generously funded by DFID through the Girls Education Challenge. We work in 84 schools in Dadaab and Kakuma refugee camps, as well as the surrounding host community. And we focus on learning outcomes, so improvements to literacy and numeracy scores, retention in school, and ensuring that girls are transitioning from year to year, and also on sustainability and how we interpret sustainability in this context, which is a challenging refugee and protracted humanitarian context, is around changing social norms around girls' education. So as the name implies, this is an equity-focused intervention. So though boys benefit indirectly from Some of the structural interventions that we do in this project, such as teacher training, school improvements, provision of psychosocial counseling services, just as a few examples. Girls are at the heart of the initiative. And of course, as I'm sure many of you have experienced in your own work, when the focus is on girls and on correcting some of these historic inequalities, we are always potentially susceptible to backlash. And this is one of the many reasons why community engagement is so, so critical. Next slide, please, Peter. Thank you. So some of the challenges, we find these types of challenges everywhere, but in our specific context, poverty remains the single most important barrier to girls accessing education. One of the other key barriers that we find is a very high domestic chore burden. So girls spending a quarter or more of their day, sometimes their entire day doing chores. Obviously this impacts on their attendance. It also impacts on their ability to do schoolwork and therefore to stay up to speed with their classmates. And then social norms, of course, another critical barrier that intersects with all of these other barriers in important ways. So the social norms around who is responsible for domestic chores, of course, that puts the onus on girls. And then social norms related to early and forced marriage, for example. So some other contextual challenges, we can see that over half of the girls in our target population are from female-headed households. The poverty barrier, of course, is strong. And when working with a lot of female-headed households, of course, we see this phenomenon often referred to as the feminization of poverty. So this poverty burden becomes extra important when working with female-headed households. In terms of changing social norms and community mobilization around social norms, we've gradually shifted our approach over the years. When we first began this project in 2013, we really focused, generally speaking, on getting people to support the idea of girls' education, to set higher aspirations and ambitions for girls beyond traditional roles. And now that we've seen strong progress in that area, we've moved to focusing on more specific barriers in which social norms are more subtly embedded. So household chore burden is being one of those key ones. And I think that I'm sure a lot of you find this in your own programming. Attitudes, or reported attitudes anyway, are very easy to change. People are very good at telling you what you want to hear sometimes, but we know that really good, deep, engaging, meaningful community mobilization is critical, and we have to change not only attitudes but also behaviors and those deeply embedded social norms. Next slide, please, Peter. Thank you. So our solution and the approach that we've taken is really focused on community mobilizers as being at the heart of this change. So this chart above kind of shows, in simple terms, our theory of change for KEEP. So what this chart really emphasizes is that improved communication and interaction between the learner, the parents, and the school is critical to create an environment that is conducive to learning. So just as one example, if girls feel safe to confide in their teachers about challenges they're having in school, they can get better support. If teachers have the skills to go to parents and engage with parents to discuss girls' performance, we can expect better outcomes. So making sure that the learner has a better chance at success is all about facilitating that interaction between these three elements. And that's how we think about it in KEEP. So how do we actually get this interaction to happen, of course, is another step. So fundamentally, our community mobilization model is simple. It's about hiring people who understand the community and who can facilitate important conversations between critical actors within the education system. As we know, in so many ways, development, changing social norms, it's really about simply building relationships between people and facilitating that exchange. So we work with a network of approximately 52 young people who are full-time salaried staff of the project, many of whom are former KEEP beneficiaries themselves. They communicate key messages to the public. They're responsible for data collection and community engagement activities as well. We provide them with training and support, and they engage with religious and community leaders to speak out publicly on girls' education. So next slide, please. So results, as we all know, I think attribution is a bit of a sticky wicket, sometimes difficult to fully prove. So of course we have to understand that there are other social changes happening around us. Community mobilization and this kind of work never occurs in a vacuum, but we have seen some quite promising results from our engagement. So from baseline of this phase to midline, so 2017 to 2019, we've had a 25% reduction in the percentage of girls who spend a quarter of their day or more doing household chores. So we have seen a difference there. Of course, there's still a big barrier, but there seems to be progress here with people prioritizing education above these kinds of chores. And we've also seen an improvement in girls who say that they decide at what age they get married, work with their family to make that decision. So those changes in girls negotiating and social power within the family and their ability to talk about these kinds of issues is quite important. So I'm out of time, so I'll leave it there and look forward to questions later. Thank you.
All right, so let's hand back over to Ellen, please.
Thanks, Stephanie. We'll move on to the next section, which is looking at gender-responsive strategies for coordination. And under this section, addressing gender dimensions requires joint planning, information exchange, and collaboration on design, response, and service delivery with multiple actors. Government education authorities would ideally assume a leadership role in the education response, but where education authorities lack capacity or legitimacy, leadership may be assigned to an existing education coordination group, such as a local education group or an education cluster. Gender is an important cross-cutting issue for the cluster approach, as it provides strengthened opportunities for gender-responsive programming, such as intersectoral working group activities, joint education needs assessments, as well as performance monitoring and lessons learned exercises which feature gender. Next slide, please. And the next section looks at gender-responsive strategies for analysis. And this section reflects specific gender-related results that address gaps and challenges identified during the assessment phase. This includes processes such as needs assessments, monitoring, and evaluation, as shown in the graphic which is on the slide in front of you at the moment. In addition, building the capacity of the affected community to collect and analyze information is key to ensuring ownership and ongoing feedback based on direct perspectives from the girls, boys, women, and men. There are a number of different methods communities can use to monitor the effectiveness of interventions. An example is the Somali Girls Education Promotion Project, which is funded by DFID's Girls Education Challenge Fund, where girl-led tools have been employed to explore how changes in gender norms have an effect on education outcomes. I'm pleased to introduce Lord of KUSA to take us through this.
Thank you, Ellen. So, as Ellen introduced, I am going to speak about gender-responsive education programming and monitoring and evaluation in our program in Somalia, the Somali Girls Education Promotion Project. Peter, next slide, please. So, Our project works mostly in rural and remote areas of Somalia, many of which are heavily affected by conflict as well as migration and pastoralism. Girls have poorer educational outcomes than boys across the board. And this is related to factors that happen at the school and the community. It's related to household factors such as poverty and unequal allocation of chores, as well as parents' perceptions about education for girls. But it's also related to a number of factors about the girls themselves and how they internalize the social and gender norms that they are exposed to, as well as how they are unequally affected by the circumstances they are facing, ultimately leading to anxiety and depression and reducing their self-confidence, their voice, and ability to engage in class. Next slide, please. So, SONGEP, the Somali Girls Education Promotion Project Transition, is addressing poor learning outcomes by looking at gender from a holistic perspective. So looking at the classroom, looking at school governance, looking at how the ministry is looking at gender and supporting their capacity building, as well as looking at social norm change at household, community, and the girls themselves. And it's currently working in 199 schools and reaching over 27,000 marginalized girls. It's evaluated using a quasi-experimental evaluation design. And it has been tracking girls longitudinally since 2013. Next slide, please. So when we are speaking about gender-responsive teaching under SONGEP, we are speaking about a number of different things. How classroom practices reflects traditional gender and social norms and might be excluding girls as well as girls from specific subgroups of the population. How teachers and school leaders are tracking absenteeism and retention for both girls and boys and the levels of tolerance to absenteeism. How female teachers are hired and kept within the system. How teachers and the school leaders are supporting child protection or are not supporting it. And last but not least, how teachers and school leaders are helping girls to develop their voice and self-confidence. Next slide, please. So in practice, this means that we are working in a synchronized manner at the system level, working both at the ministries of education. We are working with 3 different ministries of education within Somalia. And we are supporting gender units to work with teachers and school leaders to improve gender sensitive and responsive practices at the school. For instance, gender sensitive practices towards female teachers, as well as gender responsive practices in classroom at the level of the school management on child protection, as well as looking at how gender is being addressed at the ministry's budgeting and planning in general. But we are also working with pre-service training providers and trying to help them to see how gender plays out in classroom. At the school level, that means working at the classroom on content delivery, addressing specific girls' needs, and building girls' self-confidence, voice, and vision. Next slide, please. So what's happening after we did all of this? We are seeing that teachers are improving on the use of formative assessments, and this use is decreasing in the comparison group. The female students feel more welcome in the classroom, and the teachers are consistently providing more encouraging feedback to girls. And all of this is over and above the comparison group. Next slide, please. When developing girls' voice and self-confidence, we are seeing a direct impact on that, on reading skills acquisition. You can see here that the girls who are participating in girls empowerment forums are performing much above 29% points above in terms of reading comprehension scores in relation to the comparison group. Next slide, please. And the dropout has halved in comparison with the comparison group. And Girls Empowerment Forum participants, girls who are exposed to training on improving their self-confidence, their voice, their vision, are 11% points more likely to have positive transitions in relation to the comparison girls. Last slide, please. So when you look at Khadijah's words here, you can see why things are changing. It's all about the ability to ask questions when not understanding the content, asking the teachers to clarify things, and interacting with other students in a confident manner, sometimes even teaching them. And that makes a lot of a difference in terms of learning outcomes. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lot, for sharing that case study. We'll quickly move on to the next section, and I'm pleased to introduce Emily, who is with the United Nations Girls Education Initiative, but also co-convenes the Gender Task Team, who will present the next two sections of the guidance notes on strategies for equal access and gender-responsive learning environments, and for gender-responsive teaching and learning. Emily?
Hello, everyone. Thanks a lot, Ellen. So the second section of the guidance note deals, as Ellen mentioned, with strategies for equal access and gender-responsive learning environments. So this covers protection and well-being, as well as facilities and services. So in this section, we'll review some selected highlights and examples from this section. Next slide, please, Peter. So beginning with equal access, the guidance note provides an overview of barriers that can prevent girls, boys, women and men from accessing education. These examples on the slide intend to help guide needs assessment and gender analysis in specific contexts. So the guidance note actually demonstrates a useful way of identifying and analysing barriers that result directly from conflict and crisis by looking at them at these three levels. So firstly, at the institutional level, this can, for example, include destruction of facilities and services, including sanitation facilities, which can, of course, affect girls' attendance. Then at the second community level, there are barriers related to displacement, which can affect girls' and boys' ability to attend schools safely. And then lastly, at the individual or relational level, there are multiple barriers present, and these can include various factors relating to school-related gender-based violence, for example. So the guidance note, as you can see on the slide, provides examples of these barriers at each level, and then potential strategies that have worked to address them. So let's just take a closer look at one example at the relational and individual level. So learners can be at risk of corporal punishment, sexual violence, bullying, and potential response strategies include integrating targeted school-related gender-based violence strategies into EIE programming. This can include, for example, developing a code of conduct, a school safety plan, and of course, training school staff on available referral services. Next slide, please, Peter. There are, of course, barriers to education that result indirectly from conflict and crisis in the form of discriminatory social norms, which usually become worse in such contexts. So these can include opportunity costs, where boys' education can be often prioritized as poverty increases during instability. Secondly, early marriage, which can often form part of a family's protection strategy to minimize their economic burden in times of instability. And then there's also early or unintended pregnancy. So let's take a closer look at this last example. Education systems can have policies or practices in place that might discriminate against pregnant learners or young mothers. So some response strategies include the ensuring re-entry and continuation policies are in place, promoting non-formal education opportunities, promoting school health and childcare services, and including comprehensive sexuality education into the curriculum. Next slide, please, Peter. So the guidance note also deals with the question of protection and well-being. As we know, conflict and crisis can undermine the protective nature of learning environments. Girls, boys, women and men, and of course, different groups within these categories can face many different risks to their protection and well-being. And this in turn can affect their access and participation in education in very different ways. So ensuring that responses are equitable and appropriate means identifying these particular risks and including, importantly, these overlapping vulnerabilities. So for example, having a disability or being a child head of household. So the guidance notes protection and wellbeing section provides specific examples, tips and promising practice in relation to this. So for example, on gender-based violence, the guidance note outlines prevention and response at the school community level, as well as in the classroom, such as creating safe school policies or through life skills training for teachers and learners. The guidance also provides information on access to services and managing referrals. So for example, as we'll see on the slide here, the guide includes tips and experience on the importance of conducting contextual analysis to understand some of the more informal existing structures that may be being used in specific contexts. So here we have the example of Liberia, where 27 informal referral steps were identified versus 4 steps in the official referral system. So what here are then the implications for GBV prevention and response in strategies in country, considering this information? Next slide, please. The guidance note also covers aspects of facilities and services related to the potential physical damage of schools during a crisis and the opportunities this can then present to rehabilitate education infrastructure that better meets the needs of female and male learners as well as teachers. So the guidance note offers direction on considerations in relation to the location of facilities and services that can minimize risk and discrimination of certain groups, as well as gender-responsive sanitation facilities, menstrual hygiene management, by bringing together key aspects of existing toolkits. So for example, the toolkit for integrating menstrual hygiene management into humanitarian responses. So here on this slide, we have the example of the female-friendly toilet, where the guidance note outlines important considerations such as being separately located, ensuring privacy through indoor latch, options for hygienically storing belongings while using the facilities, nighttime light source, water access, bins with lids, ensuring doors, walls and roofs are non-transparent. And finally, to ensure that some units, of course, have disability access. So that, in brief, concludes the guidance note section on strategies for equal access and gender-responsive learning environments. I'm going to move, next slide please, Peter. I'm going to move straight on to the guidance notes third section on gender-responsive teaching and learning. So this section of the guide covers curricula and gender-responsive instruction and learning processes. The guide provides example strategies that can be employed to make the learning experience more gender-responsive and participatory, as well as a series of steps that education practitioners can take to remove gender bias from vocational, technical or skills training. But for this particular session, we'll focus on curricula and related aspects. Next slide, please, Lisa. So curriculum content can play an important role in the promotion of sustainable recovery, as we know, through contributing to rebuilding social cohesion, developing positive national identities, for example. And crisis often changes the education environment and can present us with the opportunity to address negative gender norms and teach values of inclusion and gender equality. So improving curricula to make them more gender responsive is one way of contributing to this. So, of course, an emergency context might not necessarily allow for a formal curricular review, but it's nonetheless good practice to build consensus to assess the curriculum from a gender perspective, together with relevant education actors, and to support teachers to initiate small changes to make their curriculum more inclusive and relevant in emergencies. The guidance notes provides a range of tips on what this means in practice and its application. So, for example, on teaching and learning materials, the next slide shows, next slide please, yeah, that curriculum content can contain bias and stereotypes that represent encouraging girls, boys, and women and men to act in specific ways. So the images here from the guidance note are depicting some classic stereotypical content of textbooks. And while, as I mentioned earlier, formal revision or development of new materials is often not possible in an emergency context, reviewing materials informally is a useful way of addressing negative gender stereotypes. So key questions can be asked with the aim of showing girls, boys, women and men in a variety of roles that promote equality, assessing how male and female characters are portrayed, how they are described in teaching materials, for example. And teachers can also be encouraged to use alternative strategies, such as using existing materials to encourage critical thinking, inviting local role models to share their experience with learners in class, and asking learners open-ended questions on the content of material. The guidance note also provides examples of curriculum content that can be used to promote gender equality across various subjects, such as human rights education, peace education, and conflict-sensitive education. So that concludes the brief overview of these two sections of the guidance notes on gender. I will hand it right now back to Ellen. Thank you.
Thank you, Emily. So we're moving on to section 4, which focuses on strategies for gender-responsive policies and support for teachers and other education personnel. Teachers have a central role in delivering quality, inclusive education, and they have the opportunity to create new, more inclusive and equitable norms and standards in classrooms. Qualified teachers can be in short supply in an emergency setting and may have limited training and may bring their own gender biases and tolerances of GBV, as well as psychosocial concerns. Issues that may compromise school as a safe place can be addressed by providing teachers with pedagogical and inclusion training and psychological support and supervision to help them provide positive and beneficial learning experiences for girls, boys, women, and men. And so the guidance note provides direction on recruitment and selection, conditions of work, teacher training, professional development and support, as well as support and supervision. Next slide, please. So we shall now focus on the teacher training and support section of the guide and looking at gender-responsive teacher training content. Investing in support to teachers in an emergency is an important part of the education response. The teacher training process can take various forms and should encourage teachers to support gender-responsive education by examining their own gender biases and providing tools to promote gender-equitable school environments. Gender-responsive training, teacher training, should be grounded in human rights and cover gender-responsive pedagogy and teaching methodologies. And this can be used across subject areas, positive discipline and classroom management, participatory approaches to ensure active management of female and male learners, as well as inclusive planning and assessment. In Mozambique and South Sudan, gender-responsive pedagogy teacher training has shown positive results And I will now hand over to Erica Fotheringham at Plan International Canada to present this particular case study. Erica?
Hi, everyone. So I'm a gender equality specialist here at Plan International Canada. And today I will be briefly touching on the development of the Gender-Responsive Pedagogy Teacher Training Manual and its implementation with a focus on the adaptations made for the South Sudan crisis in 2016. Next slide. So we implemented the GRPTT in Mozambique through a project called Amor and in South Sudan through a project called Success. Both projects were funded by Dubai Cares and Plan International Canada. Both projects aim to empower girls and young women aged 6 to 20 years to realize their rights to education and participation in safe, quality learning environments. A key strategy for achieving this is building the capacity of teachers to create gender-responsive learning environments. Next slide. So there is a limited but growing body of evidence suggesting that exposing teachers to gender-responsive teaching techniques during pedagogical training can facilitate learner empowerment in classrooms and challenge the stereotypical expectations of boys and girls. Within the current landscape of approaches that respond to this, the Forum of African Women Educationalists can be credited as a thought leader. They developed the gender-responsive pedagogy model to address considerations in both the teaching practices and environment in schools across Eastern and Southern Africa. Plan International Canada's GRPTT package has built on this concept of gender-responsive pedagogy, taking it a step further, and has applied it across a program of pedagogical training for teachers. The GRPTT integrates gender equality into practical child-centered pedagogical training. So for example, while teachers are building their skills for informal assessment, they are exploring how to avoid gender bias and understand how to address barriers to participation. This practical integration affords teachers the opportunity to explore the application of gender considerations in their day-to-day teaching practices and activities. Next slide. The content of the 10-day GRPTT is organized into 4 modules. The first being gender-responsive schools, the second being learning and teaching, the third being positive discipline, and the fourth being engaging the community. Days 1 to 3 set the foundation for gender responsiveness by introducing the concept and inviting teachers to explore their own personal experiences of gender, and by mapping out key issues for boys and girls in and around their own schools. For example, identifying and responding to school-related gender-based violence. Gender considerations are then mainstreamed and discussed across pedagogical, positive discipline, and community engagement sessions tackled in days 4 to 10. The training content is strengthened through ongoing teacher reflection circles, facilitated by head teachers and supported by local education authorities throughout the year. The GRPTT package uses a localized cascade training approach by building the capacity of local Ministry of Education trainers to deliver the GRPTT. This ensures ministry ownership of the program, promotes sustainability, and prepares head teachers to lead on ongoing reflection circles. These trainers then train teachers on the package during school holidays. Trainers then monitor teaching in class and provide instructional guidance and support to teachers. The GRPTT not only provides teachers with the conceptual foundation for gender-responsive education, but it also guides teachers to develop the practical skills for promoting gender equality in the classroom. After completing the 10-day training, teachers are expected to recognize the unique challenges and barriers that girls and boys face in accessing and completing school, and respond by using child-friendly teaching practices that provide equal opportunities for both girls and boys to learn and to thrive at school and that promote gender equality in the classroom. Next slide. Amor was a 5-year project launched in 2014 designed to improve girls' primary school completion and transition to secondary school. Girls in Mozambique face multiple barriers to and within education, as highlighted on the slide. Next slide. Success was launched in 2014, and the project aimed at improving access to safe, quality learning environments in South Sudan. In South Sudan, girls face multiple barriers to and within education, even more so in an emergency context. As highlighted in the slide, I invite you to refer to both of these slides in more detail to further understand the context once they are shared online. Next slide. So the GRPTT was adapted for emergency contexts when violence broke out in South Sudan in July 2016. Due to security constraints, the Success Project closed in September 2016, but key activities continued by Plan International until July 2017, including the GRPTT. In early 2017, the adapted package included guidance on implementation in the conflict setting with specific sessions to emphasize and opportunities to integrate conflict sensitivity throughout. Next slide. Specific adaptations were made to each module in the manual to reflect the emergency context in South Sudan. Such adaptations include, but of course are not limited to, adapting key discussion questions to fit the context, such as discussing how girls and boys experience food insecurity differently, or can selecting the right teaching method for the content help teachers teach in emergency contexts. They also looked at adjusting pedagogy techniques to suit larger class sizes, so such as assigning a girl and boy student who attend class regularly to act as classroom helpers, or to utilize outside space for group work when the classroom gets too noisy. Discussing techniques to manage increased workload in lesson planning, and of course, emphasizing the importance of psychosocial support and child protection through discussion on how students learn in an emergency setting, and the importance of recognizing signs of distress in children and referring children who require extra support to psychosocial services in the community. This methodology is anchored in leveraging the contextual knowledge and the expertise of teachers based on principles of co-creating solutions for greater ownership and sustainability. The adaptations invite teachers to brainstorm practical ideas for addressing gender-specific barriers girls and boys face in meaningful participation at school. For example, we know that menstrual hygiene management is a large barrier for adolescent girls through local myths and stereotypings related to MHM and the overall lower status accorded to the education of girls due to gender norms. An activity to address this would be to invite the teachers to look at the issue of absenteeism and to come up with ideas on how to address the household and community barriers, as well as barriers at school, and how to support the agency of girls. We are mindful that it can be the case that locally generated solutions can perpetuate gender stereotypes and violent supportive behaviors. Therefore, the facilitator of the GRPT training is key in raising questions and minimizing any gender stereotyping. At the heart of this methodology is critical reflection, so solutions are owned by teachers and well implemented. Next slide. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Erica. I'll now hand it over to Emily to take us through section 5, which is focusing on strategies for gender-responsive education policy. Emily?
Yes, thank you very much, Ellen. So this last brief section will deal with section 5 of the guidance note, and it covers law and policy formulation and financing for education and emergencies. But in these final slides, we'll outline some of the key considerations related to the guidance notes section on planning and implementation. Next slide, please. So gender-responsive education policy can involve both targeted dimensions, such as specific national policies on girls' education, as well as mainstreamed approaches where sector-wide policies consider gender issues throughout. In fact, the key principles guiding the development of a gender-responsive policy apply to all policies and plans, whether in conflict and crisis situations or not. The important thing here is that conflict and crisis situations can provide a window of opportunity to use existing tools such as humanitarian, refugee, or joint response plans to advocate for gender-appropriate responses and for relevant coordination across sectors, of course, and in turn to influence gender equality considerations in the development of emergency, transitional, as well as preparedness planning. In addition, these considerations are crucial to working at the humanitarian development nexus by making explicit linkages between longer-term gender equality objectives and shorter-term concerns that have more traditionally been linked to girls' and boys' access to education in humanitarian situations. Next slide, please. So in the final slide of this short section, let's look at some of the key elements that make up a gender-responsive plan, make up gender-responsive plans of various kinds. As previously mentioned, these general principles applicable in all cases, but that crucially must be guided, as the first principle at the top here shows, by a context-specific analysis of gender-related vulnerabilities. And in the case of emergency situations related to the roles and experiences of conflict and crisis across diverse groups of girls, boys, women, and men, including assessing the overall environment, so including formal structures like national laws and sector policies, as well as informal structures such as beliefs about gender roles. Secondly, plans must be non-discriminatory. They must be able to meet the education rights of all children by assessing the reasons for disparities between groups. And must also be designed to ensure that gender inequalities should be a consideration alongside other factors such as wealth, religion, disability, etc. Thirdly, plans, of course, must be developed transparently and through a participatory approach. Fourthly, they should be evidence-based and consideration given to collecting and using sex disaggregated data. And where a full analysis is not possible, as is often the case in a crisis setting, available data can be used and complemented on an ongoing basis with what might be feasible to collect as an emergency unfolds. Fifth, plans must be strategic. This means considering links with other sectors, focusing on key actions relevant to boys and girls over the short, medium, and longer term, and also considering how plans might build on existing broader commitments to gender equality. Sixth, plans must be designed with practicality as a main concern, thinking about how easy a plan is to implement. Plans should identify responsibilities for partners and be very specific about targets that can be tracked across results for girls, boys, women, and men. And finally, plans, of course, must be costed and funded, ensuring support is available both for gender mainstreaming as well as targeted activities to support gender equality programming. So, for example, considering specific questions coming from your gender analysis, such as, is there adequate budget targeting marginalized girls, for example? So that concludes this brief section on policy, and in fact, the webinar's overview of each section of the guidance notes. So thank you very much, and I'll pass you back to Ellen.
Thanks, Emily. So yeah, that's the end of the presentations, but maybe before we get to the question and answer section, I'll say a little bit about uptake activities for the guidance note on gender. So some of you may already be aware that the guidance note is already being actively used in the field, and also that we have plans to support tailored orientation sessions on the use of the guide from field level to senior management level through the development of a facilitator's guide. And so we kindly request your feedback around some of the strategies that we can use to promote awareness and use of the guide more broadly. These may range from more detailed webinars on each section, perhaps comprehensive training or online training. So feel free to give us some ideas on some of those strategies that we can use to really boost the use of the guide by a variety of stakeholders. Next slide. Thanks, Peter. So I think we are now in the question and answer section, and thank you all so much for the questions that you've been fielding through the chat box. And just mindful of our time, what I'll do is I'll give each of the case study presenters an opportunity to answer. Maybe we'll take a round of one question each and then see how we're doing. If we're not able to get, and likely we won't be able to get to all the questions, we'll be able to send through some responses to your questions together with the PowerPoint presentation. So Stephanie, maybe if I could start with you, since your case study was focusing on participation, what would you say, one of the questions that was in the chat box was, what are the main challenges you face to engage and mobilize the community? And what are the main attributes of the community mobilizers? If you could just respond to that, maybe in a minute or less.
Great, thanks, Ellen. So great question, especially around kind of attributes of community mobilizers. A role that is really so focused on relationship building. It's quite critical that the community mobilizers themselves are number one, grounded in their community, a really good understanding of the issues, speak the language, understand the local context. We also tend to look for community mobilizers who are young. We look for a gender balance of community mobilizers. So we obviously want role models for girls, but at the same time, it's equally important to showcase kind of men championing girls' education and being those role models in the community. And we look for people with outgoing personalities, with that ability to connect with others, with those really critical soft skills. The challenges that we have in community mobilization, I'm sure lots of other people here have the same. I think the single biggest challenge is just, I think, people are happy to tell you what you want to hear and are maybe reluctant to engage as deeply as we would want them to. People are, yeah, of course I support girls' education, but meanwhile they've stopped sending their own daughter to school. And of course there's that element of backlash against the specific focus of the project on girls. So kind of how do we overcome that? Part of it is giving great training to our community mobilizers and helping them. We focus a lot on engagement of men and boys specifically, and giving them training in order to come at it from kind of a men championing girls' education, a male allyship approach, and getting especially influential men in the community on side as you're not part of the problem, you're part of the solution, and we want to work together on that. And I think that's critical, a positive approach towards mobilization. I'll leave it there.
Thanks, Stephanie, for your answer. Maybe I can move on to Lot. Lot, thank you so much. We've been responding to many of the questions in the chat box, but there is one question I think that you hadn't managed to get to. In your presentation, you showed the different categories of barriers, individual, household, and community. Has your project which category of barriers which brings the most significant impact?
So as I typed in the chat box, the barriers really depend on the outcome you are looking at. And a typical case are the differences that we have seen in different barriers affecting literacy and numeracy. For example, girls' systematic absenteeism through pastoralist migration, through chores, through menstrual-related absenteeism, ultimately relates to literacy very strongly. Surprisingly, it doesn't affect numeracy. And it's teachers' capacity to deliver on numeracy, as well as teachers' capacity to deliver gender equitable sessions on numeracy that make a difference for girls. Retention is also affected by a whole different range of factors. For instance, disability has a very strong impact on retention, more so than in learning. So it's also about different types of girls being affected by different barriers at different times.
Great, thanks. Unfortunately, Ellen has lost her Zoom connection, so I'm gonna move on to the next presenter. So Erica, it would be great if you could share with us a little bit more about how men and boys are included in the programs that you described.
You bet. Thank you so much for giving me the opportunity, and I'll be brief considering we're close out of time. So of course, the engagement of men and boys is key to any holistic gender equality strategy and approach to programming. Both male and female teachers are trained on the GRPT manual And in fact, in South Sudan specifically, there is a majority of male teachers compared to female teachers. And the first portion of the GRPT manual actually really does a deep dive into gender responsive education and gives teachers, both male and female, an opportunity to examine their own gender biases. Further to that, both boys and girls obviously benefit within the learning environment, and the GRPTT manual does focus on ways to include both boys and girls. Of course, we do focus on girls, but boys, of course, are never left out of that conversation. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Erica. I think we are almost at time, so we will not be able to, unfortunately, answer more questions. But as I said before, the plan is to look at your questions and ask the presenters to provide some responses, and then we can share those together with the presentations. So it leaves me to thank you all so much for joining, and to thank all our presenters and the team behind the scene for this webinar. We look forward to your feedback. Please feel free to reach out to Emily or myself or any members of the Gender Task Team with your ideas of how we can really make this guidance note on gender most useful for you and your teams. So thank you all so much for joining. Thank you very much.